to another exciting episode of the Q&A with Ryan and Andy. I'm Andy. This is Ryan.
Hello.
We're from Perfect Brewing Supply, just in case. Through tonight's topic, we got a lot of questions and requests to go over yeast harvesting and reusing yeast and all things in between. We've got some great questions from some people. And we also have some stuff prepared. So as we start rolling, feel free to definitely ask questions away as we get going. But it seems to be a lot of people talking about how to. We field a lot of questions in store as far as what do I do? I mean, even if we talk about yeast starters or reusing yeast or pitching on top of the yeast cake, and we'll talk about a lot of those topics like that. But I think we'll start off with just a basic understanding is what is yeast harvesting, Ryan?
Yeah, if you guys have other questions, feel free to throw those out because this is a live Q&A. I think we should field questions as they come in, yes. But this is kind of our background topic, I guess, which is harvesting yeast. A lot of people or some new homebrewers don't realize that after the yeast is fermented their beer, that it's still alive and ready to ferment more beer or wort, I guess you should say. So what a lot of people or some homebrewers get into is reading up on how to reuse the yeast in a proper way. There's some very simple ways to do it, and there's some ways on some forums I've seen around that may work, but are probably not what I would recommend. So I came up with kind of 4 ways to reuse or harvest yeast. Harvesting yeast, you may see it referred to as cropping on some sites. It's just collecting yeast at either the bottom of the fermenter or the top, or just kind of collecting yeast from the fermenter, whether it's done fermenting or in the middle of fermenting. So there's a traditional method called top cropping, which is just brewing the beer like normal, letting it ferment, and when it's about halfway done fermenting, there's that krausen that forms, and you can skim the top of that. There's
the whipped cream looking stuff.
The whipped cream called the krausen, or the foam on top. It just looks like a foam on like a normal beer when it's poured from the faucet or something. So top cropping is just skimming off the brownish kind of crust on top. Get rid of that, and then underneath that is like some of the healthiest yeast you can reuse almost indefinitely, according to what I've been reading. But something to remember is you can really only do that with top fermenting yeast, which is pretty much all yeast, ale yeast. Can't really do it with lager yeast because they're all sitting at the bottom of the fermenter. Ale yeast kind of sit at the top. So if you have a bucket that you can get in with like a sanitized spoon and scoop off, that's a really good way to do it. I'd recommend having a little bit of starter wort in a mason jar to throw that into, so it has some sort of medium to sit in before you get around to using it again.
Yeah, just ready to go. So that way you don't have this spoonful of whipped cream looking stuff and no place to put it. So preparation, I think, is pretty key on this, just so you reduce the chance of bad things happening, whether it be little other beasties getting in or the dog coming by and licking the spoon. I don't know, but yeah, good preparation.
Yeah, and apparently it's a very safe and clean way to do it, because I just learned this today. Wild yeast and bacteria, they don't come to the top. They all, if they're in there to begin with, they're going to be either in the middle or at the bottom. So skimming that off the top, you're safe from bacteria and wild yeast. They don't come to the top like ale yeast does.
Now, how much do you think you can safely take off? And I don't know if you know this answer. Like if you wanted to do 10 little baby batches from this one top cropping yeast krausen, so to speak, how many do you think?
Yeah, I mean,
I've never thought of that. I'm just trying to think.
It's tricky to get precise with how much yeast to add, but you can get quite a bit off of that. And the big thing about it is it's the healthiest yeast. There's always cell count, and then there's always viability. Viability and yeast health is always going to be the more important thing than cell count. So you can probably divvy that up quite a bit just by collecting, I don't know, a half a cup or something worth of slurry just off the krausen on top
Just
of your
curious.
beer.
So basically, don't get in there with the soup ladle.
You don't want to go too deep.
Okay.
You don't want to get actually into the wort. You just want to skim. They call it the dirt layer, which is usually proteins and trub and hops.
Okay.
So you skim that off, and then below that, between that and the wort itself, is very healthy yeast that you can top crop.
Yeah. Cool. I don't know if anyone else has tried that out there. I know that's something I'm going to be trying here shortly. I flirt with the idea, but
especially like Hefeweizen yeast. That's the biggest one that ferments very violently and creates a very big krausen where there's lots and lots of yeast just waiting to be harvested and reused if you are prepared for it, I guess.
Yeah, it'd be kind of fun. But yeah.
So that's a common way to harvest yeast. The way I always did it for years was just overbuilding my starter. I did starters for pretty much everything, even if I was doing a 3-gallon batch as opposed to a normal 5. I would just go to my calculator for my yeast, and after I picked my yeast, I'd decide on a couple beers to make with that strain. I'd do a big yeast starter and overbuild it by more than I might have actually need on the batch I was brewing coming up. And then just once I went to pitch that into the actual beer I was brewing, I would pour off a half a pint or something, or a quarter pint into a little sanitized mason jar and throw that right in the fridge. That way there's no trub or anything. It's just wort and yeast, and it looks really nice and creamy and white, like you'd want a pure yeast culture to look.
And as we get going, we'll talk about yeast washing and some of that stuff that is a little bit more time consuming and labor intensive, why the top cropping may be a really easy way to do this versus washing your yeast and things like that. But that's food for thought later. We got our first question.
Oh, cool.
Dan asked us, does it help to skim that brown layer off as a matter of course during fermentation?
Yeah, I've seen some breweries that do that. I think Russian River does that because they don't want it to drop back into the beer and cause potential off flavors. But I don't know if I'd get in there and be that meticulous about it on every batch. It's probably not going to hurt anything, but it's I guess it could be, if you're not sanitary about it, could cause problems. But I mean, if you're sanitary about it, it's not a bad idea.
The club just had a meeting with low dose low dose oxygen. Anyway, introducing oxygen to your beer at this point, from a homebrew standpoint, where do we feel top cropping? Is that something that is going to be frowned upon? Are we going to have any negative effects of getting into your beer?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Like the small amount of trub that's up there, it's going to fall back in and settle back to the bottom, flocculate back down with the yeast once it's done fermenting. So I think the small amount that's up there isn't going to hurt that batch of beer, but it's probably not the best thing to put into your little vial of yeast that you're saving for a future batch.
Just curious. That was if there's any of the Nubs guys out there watching. We just had a great presentation about that, so I just wanted to bring that up because to see who's listening and start a really interesting banter. Another follow-up question from Dan. Or more, is there an advantage to that? I know that is a practice at least some German breweries using open fermentation. I mean, I would say that if you're doing top cropping, you're getting probably the freshest, livest, most active, healthiest yeast at any given point. So the advantage of that would just be, assuming your lag times would be much shorter. You're getting a healthy strain, so you don't have to worry about what's going on and doing starters and things like that. I don't know if you have anything to add with that, but I would think that would just be a huge advantage.
Yeah, I think it is probably going to make your beer cleaner, and there's less stuff to settle out, so it'd probably have a more pure beer flavor. Yeah.
It would also save time because many times I will pitch on yeast cakes based on what beer style, and kind of start with a low gravity beer and move my way up to some of the stronger gravity beers and just put the new wort right on the old yeast cake and trub to where I think you're going to get a much better fermentation without all the extra junk that sits at the bottom. So, but that could be a segue into yeast washing later. But what's that? Removing the crap part. I don't know what you mean, Dan. I'm sorry. Anyway.
Yeah.
Good question. Thank you.
It's always, it's probably ideal to skim that stuff off top fermenting yeast fermentations, but
especially, if you're going to save it, anything, the cleaner it is, I would say the better it's going to be. And clean, I mean by less other stuff.
Yeah.
Maybe my 2 cents. So.
Thanks, Dan,
for
the
good questions. Cool.
But you were talking about pitching onto yeast cake, which is another way to, it's not technically harvesting, I don't think, because you're not pulling it out of the fermenter. You're just kind of reusing it. So that's something I've done a couple times. Once I did it the past month, and you've done it quite a few times.
Yeah. I'm a little lazy, so I like to do that. Plus, you get a little more out of your yeast.
Yeah, for lager yeast, it can definitely help you brew something like a Doppelbock or any stronger lager, a Baltic Porter or something like that, without having to do several steps with a starter to get a proper pitch.
Yeah, you're kind of doing a starter, but you're getting a lot more beer out of it.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I look at it sometimes, where I'll start with like a light American lager I've done a few times and step that up to another lager type beer that has a little bit more sugar for that yeast to eat, and you want a little bit more of a cell count, and it gets a nice healthy pitch. But yeah.
Hey, Dave. I like beer flavor too. But if you're going to pitch onto your yeast cake, it's always a good idea to brew something smaller to begin with, and ideally have a healthy pitch going into that beer too.
Yep.
If it's a light lager, even do a 5-gallon batch, do a starter for that original 1 pack of yeast. Let that ferment out nice and healthy. And then don't move that beer off the yeast cake until you actually have the wort ready to go right onto it. I don't recommend leaving that yeast cake open for much longer than a few hours.
Yeah.
So plan to brew the day you're going to package that previous beer to go right onto that yeast cake pretty much right after you pull it off the previous batch. And step up with stronger beers, because it's one good way or one possible way to actually overpitch your yeast is by throwing it onto a yeast cake, and having a smaller beer going onto a yeast cake, you could potentially be overpitching, which is going to strip a lot of flavor from the malt and the hops, and it could cause some off flavors like acetaldehyde is created when yeast
green apple
flavors can be created when you overpitch. So it's one of the rare occasions that overpitching is a possibility. So brew stronger beers to go on your yeast cake. Don't let the yeast cake sit open for too long. Definitely no longer than.
How many times would you repitch or reuse your yeast cake, Ryan?
You can use it quite a few times, but I personally probably won't go more than like 3 or 4 times.
I've done 6.
Yeah. And I remember the 3rd and 4th were the best ones.
Yeah. It did not get better.
The second one wasn't great, but the 3rd and 4th were really, really good.
Yeah, let me phrase that. Yeah, you could see the life cycle of that yeast and what was happening, because as the yeast, as it buds, or I don't say reproduce or multiply, we'll say, you have this main cell, the mother cell, and then it has the daughter cell, which buds off. Each time you get this bud on those mothers or mother cells, they change a little bit, and so then it just becomes you get a lot more of those, and you do the daughter cells at some point, and then it changes kind of what that yeast character is going to be. It would be my take on it. Every brewer, home brewer, is probably going to have a little different take on that if you've ever done it. Some people have used yeast 10, 20 times, or they'll top crop and they'll hang on to it, or they'll repitch, or this could be a good segue into washing.
Yeah, you can wash your yeast using sterile water is the cleanest water you can get. But I was reading up on it today, and it's not the best environment for yeast to be stored with water. And I from what I read, the biggest reason for that is because the pH of water is typically up around 7. And that higher pH level, a lot of bacteria can survive in that. So there could be some bacteria thriving a little better than that actual yeast. And once that yeast pitch goes into an actual batch of wort or beer, the bacteria is going to have a stronger colony and sometimes win the battle with the yeast and cause a sour, bad batch of beer. So yeast washing, you can do it, but make sure you're extra careful smelling it and make sure it doesn't smell sour.
Yeah.
Which goes for any of these methods of harvesting or reusing yeast. If it's something that's been sitting in your fridge that you top cropped or overbuilt a starter for a month or two prior, then always smell it. Try to learn what good yeast smells like. You can kind of just do that by opening up a fresh pack from Omega or Y Yeast and just kind of learn what good yeast smells like. It just kind of smells like pure. It's very yeasty.
Yeah. You'll know when it's bad. It's really a undescribable aroma. I did just post on there an article that we found, or Ryan found, from the Homebrewers Association about what using water or don't use water to store with your yeast. So if you want to know a little bit more, probably see some fun pictures, I'm assuming.
It's a very long, detailed thread. It's from the forum. It's not an actual article, but it's a forum post by a guy that knows a lot about yeast. It can be done, but it's just not something I'd recommend.
Yeah.
It can easily go wrong.
Yeah. So without water, then was there a substance that you would use to store your yeast? Would you just use
wort?
Just wort. Perfect. And then when you're washing yeast, is there a certain part of the yeast that you're looking for of that? Because you have this gobbledygook at the bottom of your fermenter. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of different colors. There's a lot of different associated with that. Is there something that you're looking for? Is there a layer or keyword layer that you're looking for?
Yeah, there's always going to be layers. So you could even take a carboy or a bucket after you've transferred off and just dump that sludge into a big clean mason jar, let it settle. If you give it 20 or 30 minutes, it's going to settle into some thick brown sludgy stuff and then probably a very thin layer of white creamy stuff, which is the good stuff. And then above that should just be relatively clear wort. So you can take that and very slowly pour it off decant and pour the wort until the cream stuff comes out. And then when you see the sludge coming, stop. And then let that you just poured into another mason jar, let that settle another 20, 30 minutes. And then you probably do that 3 or 4 times and you should have some relatively clean, creamy looking yeast. You're just looking for creamy looking.
Keyword is creamy.
Cream, whitey.
We'll say creamy 12 more times. Creamy.
Yeah.
So it's that nice white creamy layer that we're looking for. Sorry, I just had it's like Sheboygan. It's just a fun word. Anyway.
Creamy. And it's really easy to do if you have a conical fermenter.
Yeah.
You don't have to mess with that stuff. Don't have to mess with dumping it and maybe picking up some contamination from the bucket or the mason jar or something. It's just with a conical fermenter, you got a nice dump valve on there at the way bottom of the tank that you can dump all your hops just through the valve and wait until you see a little bit of a creaminess coming through and then cut it off and then get ready with your sanitized mason jar and just dump right into that. And you got healthy yeast, and that's the easiest way to do it.
And this is a shameless plug. I'll raise my hand. This is a shameless plug, that Firmzilla fermenter. I just put a link on for that. That's a nice, really approachable from a financial perspective way to get into those conical fermenters where you can really see those yeast layers, and it has a little collection device in the bottom where you can collect that yeast without having to transfer and things like that. So if you want to harvest yeast, having a nice conical or something like that does make it a lot easier. Kind of as Ryan said, you can do it with other fermenters. It is easier having that cone that collects everything and keeps your beer on top. So it's a lot easier to separate those things. So sorry, shameless plug with the Firmzilla. We love it because you can also pressurize it and things like that. So excuse me. We got another question here. Let me bring this up here. From Bill, when doing a yeast starter, how long is it too long on the stir plate? That's a great question. How long is too long?
That's a good question. I think there's no need to leave it on any longer than 24 hours. I think it hits its maximum growth at about 18 to 24 hours. Leaving it on longer, I wouldn't let it sit on there any longer than 2, maybe 3 days tops. I mean, you're not gaining anything at some point, and at a certain point, it may just, the temperature not being cold, some cells may start to die, even though they're in suspension and moving around.
Okay. What are some cues that you think that you notice if it was been on too long, or if yeast cells are starting to die?
It does. I mean, when a starter looks very healthy, it basically looks like milky honey
Creamy.
looking. Yeah, like a yellowish creamy looking
Word
stuff.
of the day.
When it starts to look like clumps just swirling around, that's usually a bunch of clumped up cells of yeast just kind of sitting there, potentially dying.
Because we have gotten calls from people that have done starters that get that chunky look as it's floating around.
Yeah, and that could depend on the strain too.
Sorry, we have our first bug of the season that is buzzing around. So if you see us swatting, it's nothing that you guys are doing, and there's no smells back here. No. There's just a bug.
It's just a little fly. But yeah, there are certain strains that look different in a starter that may look alarming and wrong.
Yeah.
But there's a London strain that's British 8 from Omega and 1968 from Y Yeast. Mm-hmm. It's the Fuller's yeast, reportedly. That is extremely flocculent because it clumps up so much and it just drops out and creates very clear beer. But at the same time, it looks like cottage cheese. It looks a little bit gross in the starter.
Not appealing.
And there's no way to make that any different. That's just kind of what it looks like, because it's extremely flocculent. It clumps up and it drops out fast and gives you a very clear wort.
Well, I guess here's a question that sometimes we get asked: flocculation. What is high flocculation?
High flocculation is a property of yeast strains that tells you that it's going to drop very well.
Clear beer.
And give you very clear beer without filtering or anything like that.
Cool.
So yeah, they would refer the opposite as a low flocculating yeast, which is something like a Hefeweizen yeast.
Pilsner, Hefe, or hazy, high flocculating versus low flocculating, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, but there are yeasts that are affected by other things, like the hazy IPA yeast that everyone's using is classified as a high flocculent strain, but for some reason when it's dry hopped during fermentation, it becomes very low flocculating.
Yeah.
Very hazy.
That could be a different day, different topic. We could spend a whole hour or two on hazies and the science behind what makes them wonderful.
Yeah.
Let's see if we have any.
Yeah. So doing a yeast starter, do it the day before you're going to brew. If you get sidetracked or for some reason have to brew a couple days later or a week later, just throw the starter in the fridge. I'd recommend doing that over leaving it on the stir plate for another few days.
Yep. Because you can always restart it again later if it does go a few days. You can always decant. Yep. Start with a fresh starter, so you're kind of stepping it up as well. So making even more little yeast babies.
Yeah, which is something I don't really recommend. If you're going to do it the day before your starter and then pitch that whole thing or pitch the next day, I don't like decanting. I feel like you lose some of the healthiest, most viable cells in the starter by trying to pour that off down the drain, the clear stuff on top. Because if you start to see some specks of what are probably yeast coming out, those are most likely your healthiest cells that you're getting rid of. You're dumping down the drain the stuff that you just worked on making. So if you're going to cold crash and decant, I recommend cold crashing for like at least a day, maybe 2, and being extremely careful not to dump out any of that yeast you just created, because it's probably the best stuff coming out first.
Yeah. Look at the good stuff. Just put another link up there. Some tips from Y Yeast, one of our yeast manufacturers and suppliers. They do a lot of yeast research. Been in the game for a while. Definitely a good link if you want to look at a little bit more from a commercial or producer standpoint versus a home brewer standpoint. Check out that link.
Yeah, it's a lot of commercial scale stuff, but it can be utilized by homebrew at a homebrew scale as well.
What kind of beer are we drinking currently?
It's a lager I made, Uncle Dave.
It's quite delicious. Cheers.
Came out nice and clear. It's pretty.
Sorry, this is kind of strange with the camera, but
just a lager. We like light lagers to drink while we're working.
So we just had something else pop up. Nope. Okay. So we've talked about yeast harvesting.
We covered that pretty well.
What about some of the ones with the dregs? And do we want to get into that topic now, or do you want to go into something?
Yeah, that's something I had ready for. I mean, It's technically a part of harvesting yeast is for sour beers and funky beers. You can pull yeast from bottles from certain breweries that have live yeast inside the bottle. So you can buy a sour beer or a funky beer from like a Belgian brewery and drink most of it, but save the last quarter to a half inch of the beer behind and pour that into a little bit of starter wort, and you have that wild yeast captured from the bottle. There's a big list from the Mad Fermentationist that has a list of viable dregs, because there is not every sour beer you get is going to have like good bacteria. Bacteria is what makes beer sour, pretty much, or wild yeast is going to make it funky.
Yeah. So should we go on the record that Brettanomyces cerevisiae is not a sour producing yeast?
Yeah, it doesn't create acid or anything like
that. We see that. I bring that up because we see that a lot, because we take it one step further to where a lot of people have said that they don't like Brett beers because it's sour, but generally Brettanomyces cerevisiae is it's more of a wild strain that's been cultured to be a repeatable pitch, but it generally produces your barnyard characteristics.
Yeah. Barnyard horse blanket is a fun, common descriptor for it. I've never smelled a horse blanket, but I think I know what it smells like just from hearing that descriptor and smelling so many of these types of beers.
I love them, but it is a weird descriptor when you start talking barnyard and leather and funk and toes, and
some of them are kind of fruity though, so less intense.
And sometimes you get pineapple. Some of the nice ones. I actually, personally like the Brettanomyces strain when it gets into ciders and some of those, because it really adds. It's a little bit more noticeable in smaller amounts. So, but anywho, I digressed. I apologize. Carry on.
So we just posted a link to the Mad Fermentationist, which is a blog I've been following for years. I learned a lot of homebrewing techniques and tips from. It's got a list of all the bottles, breweries that package beer, funky sour beers that are actually viable to collect their dregs from to add to your own homebrew. There's lots of breweries that package sour beers, but they either pasteurize it or they use some sort of a yeast to bottle condition that is going to kill the actual brewer's yeast in there. That's an interesting kind of topic, is when beers are bottle conditioned with champagne yeast, the champagne yeast actually kills the original beer brewer's yeast strain in the bottle, but it does create carbonation. And at the same time, it doesn't actually kill the bacteria and the wild yeast. So you're not going to get that brewery's actual house yeast strain, but you are going to get the bacteria and probably the wild yeast as well, like the Brettanomyces.
Well, that's fun.
It's kind of a weird one.
Yeah.
But,
champagne yeast is evil.
It's a killer yeast.
It's a killer yeast.
It kills brewer's yeast, but it creates carbonation for those kinds of beers. So the list is handy if that's something you ever thought about trying, collecting bottle dregs from.
And it's the same process as doing a normal yeast starter. Is you'll take some of those dregs, you'll pour them into a flask, put a starter wort on it, and spin it up.
I usually don't even spin it. The oxygen is bad for some bacterias. So Brett's super hardy, so it doesn't really need Brettanomyces is very hardy. It doesn't need the aeration like some brewer's yeast. So when I'm collecting dregs like that, I'll just put it in a very weak starter wort, very low, like maybe, for example, 2 ounces of DME in a half liter of water.
Dry malt extract, DME.
DME, yeah. So it's very low gravity, but it's enough to keep those the wild yeast and the bacteria alive, and something for them to chew on and get them built up and a little bit stronger to add some flavor to a homebrew.
Yeah.
And that stuff's going to last a while. So I'll usually just throw it in a mason jar for a week. I've done it before where I collected some Brett from a bottle, some Brettanomyces from a bottle in a small amount of starter wort. And it took about 2 weeks. I kept walking by and swirling it to see, and a week in, nothing at all. And then all of a sudden, 2 weeks in, I swirled it, big foam. And it was just yeast, wild yeast, and it smelled great. And it had built itself up into a little colony that was ready to.
Yeah. And some of the fun things that we've done with a group of friends or homebrew clubs is we'll grab beers that may be on that list that have some fun dregs in them. And we do a bottle share, and we take all those dregs, pour them all into one vessel.
Yeah.
See what happens. Maybe that could be the next yeast mode competition. You heard it here first. And do some sort of wild yeast. That's fun. So if you have a group of people that like those types of things, that's kind of fun to do as well, because you're not quite sure what you're going to get to some degree, but
it doesn't always turn out
good.
But
that's brewing.
You just got to kind of smell it as you go and see what you get and add it if it smells good, basically.
Yeah. Yeast is one of those things where it's many times in a lot of literature, and my understanding and my background is it's about 80% of the flavor of beer. It provides so much more than what we give it credit for, that taking care of your yeast, whether it be proper pitch rates, doing some fun harvesting of it, temperature regulation, things like that during fermentation, it'll do some really fun things for you, or really help you make a really great beer. So that's some of the things that I always feel questions for that as well. Is your yeast is more important than what most people give it, which is take care of your yeast. It's a fun guy. Sorry.
Yeah, don't ever shortcut on the yeast. It's the last thing you want to maybe cut corners on. I don't recommend messing with the yeast. It's important.
Let's see here. Here is another, just in case anyone wants to. This is another shameless plug. I'm sorry. This is another one of the conical fermenters that we like, that does some nice things for yeast harvesting. And if you wanted to reuse yeast this way, these are from our friends up in Milwaukee, up at Spike. Definitely, we're checking them out if you wanted to go the stainless steel route and get a nice conical fermenter.
Yeah, that's the CF10. That's for 10-gallon batches. It's got a 14-gallon capacity, but they make a CF5, a 15, and a 30 as well, if you're depending on your batch size. And then there's all kinds of add-ons, bells and whistles you can throw on there to do extra fun stuff with your fermenters.
Yeah. So kind of another yeast question. Why wouldn't you use a Belgian strain on, say, a pale ale? What are the differences in all these yeast strains that we see when you walk into your homebrew shop? When you see 150 different options, and what are the differences?
The biggest difference, I think, there are usually 4 attributes to look at for each yeast strain, but the biggest thing is the flavor contribution. A Belgian yeast is going to create a lot of fruity flavors and a lot of spicy flavors. So if you're doing a lager, it's not going to work at all. I mean, it might to your taste, but it's not going to be the best choice probably. So Belgian yeast is good for Belgian styles.
Yeah.
There's British yeast. There's probably a dozen different options there that have different levels of attenuation, flocculation, alcohol strength, and temperature ranges.
What's attenuation?
So that was what I was going to get into, is one of the main attributes of yeast. Besides, we covered flocculation already, which is how well that yeast strain is going to drop out and clarify your beer or leave the beer clear. Attenuation is another important thing to look at, and it's usually communicated by percentage. So, for example, something like American ale yeast has, I think, about a 70 to 75% attenuation. I'm kind of guessing, could be wrong, but it's somewhere in that range. So that means 75% of the available sugars in a certain batch of wort are actually able to be processed and fermented by that strain of yeast. Certain Belgian strains have higher percentage of attenuation, potential attenuation. So those can actually ferment more sugars than an American yeast in a lot of cases. So by looking at the attenuation potential of a certain strain, it'll tell you in a lot of cases how dry or how sweet that beer is going to end up if you choose that strain of yeast.
Just something you can we can take that knowledge and kind of rewind it back to last month when we were talking about recipe formulation. When you start writing your recipes and things like that, you can kind of predict where that final gravity is going to be based on the attenuation of the yeast. So it's an important number to know, especially if you're an all grain and you're tracking your efficiency of your brew process. Even an extract too, you can kind of predict some things that way to give you some good insight. But sorry.
And I mean, some extreme cases, there's the French Saison yeast from Omega or Y yeast.
Diastaticus.
It has a certain gene in it that allows it to ferment a lot more complex sugars than any other brewer's yeast, pretty much. So that one ferments, I think attenuation could be 90 to 95%.
Just count on it taking you down to 1.00 is your gravity. Just plan on that. Everything else, if it doesn't hit that, it's a bonus. But some of the things we did find out that if you do use those French Saison yeast or anything with diastaticus, is you really got to be good with your cleaning after the fact, because it will hide in some little crevices, even in little O-rings and things like that in your spigots and things like that. So keep that in mind. We've had to solve some problems for folks. Basically, we weren't quite sure, and it took us a while to troubleshoot, but we found out they brewed with a strain that had that little genetic anomaly in there, and all their beers are fermenting out to bone dry, and we couldn't figure it out.
It's a contamination issue. It gets into plastics, and it comes in, it finds its way into other batches that it's not supposed to.
Don't panic. Just with good cleaning, you can still use it with. I don't want to put the fear in people that don't use it, because I really like Saisons made with French Saison yeast, so I don't want people to stop brewing those because it's a fantastic style. Just maybe run that PBW or alkaline wash through it a few more minutes before you move on to the next step.
Yeah. But it is also a good a choice for a stuck fermentation, especially if it's only a few points away from where you want it. At that point, if you're doing like a stout or something like that, it should be most of the way fermented. And at that point, adding some French Saison may add a subtle background note of some Saison-y flavors, but for the most part, it should still end up tasting more stouty than anything else, but still end up finishing out to the specific gravity you had planned it to finish out at. It's an extreme case. It's a kind of a last choice to help stuck fermentation, but it almost always works. And that's because of that diastaticus gene that French Saison yeast carries.
Sorry, I had to put another shameless plug on there. Just if you want to stay in the know, subscribe to the newsletter, please. That way we know when we're doing this again or other things. But anyway, I want to keep them moving a little bit so we don't get stuck on the same links. Anyway, we've had some great questions. Feel free to keep asking. We've got yeast is one of those things, as I said, it gets overlooked quite a bit, to where we could talk for days and we could really go down a rabbit hole. I don't know if we'll go down that rabbit hole today, but we might. I would say we're probably going to wrap this up in a couple minutes here. So if there's any questions or last minute questions, now's your time. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Yeah, it is all about the dishwashing. Absolutely is. But I don't know if there's any other yeast tidbits or if there's other What's the one thing you would recommend to people about how to treat your yeast? What to do? What's the biggest thing that
starters and oxygen? Like oxygen is probably the least used source for making your yeast healthy is pure oxygen.
Mm-hmm. And when do you add that oxygen?
Right before you pitch the yeast, or I've even been experimenting with doing it in the starter and noticed even creamier looking starters, because oxygen is the first thing when yeast goes into a wort. The first thing it does is it scavenges all of the dissolved oxygen, and with that it builds a really healthy structure, which, like I said earlier, the healthier the cell, the better the fermentation. So if it has oxygen, it has a very healthy structure, and that allows it to ferment clean and exactly how you want it. Less lag time. Lag time is basically just the time between you pitch the yeast and when you actually start seeing active fermentation. So less lag time, healthier yeast, less chance for off flavors, less chance for contamination because the yeast is getting in there and combating potential contaminants like bacteria and stuff like that. Get a diffusion stone and oxygen wand that we sell from Anvil here. You go to the hardware store and buy a little, I think they're $9 or $10 for a little oxygen.
Those little red benzomatic.
These things, we have like a dozen of these here. Always.
Because at least in the state of Illinois, to get pure oxygen, you have to have a prescription from a doctor. So we do with what we can. And then when you add the oxygen, before we go too far, is you add it to the wort, right? And so as you just said, with those oxygen wands, you can stir, but you're not going to get as much of a concentration. So if you wanted to go the low tech route, you can absolutely stir that wort up before you add. But you got to think that the percentage of oxygen in atmospheric air is much lower than hitting it with pure O2 with a stone that breaks it down to the molecular level. So it really gets in there a lot more efficiently, so to speak. And we did just get a great question from Bill. How difficult is it to do slants, and is it worth it?
Talking about freezing them and storing like a bank of slants, because I mean, we've done a little bit with the yeast mode stuff in the past. We have slant tubes we carry here, so if you're interested, we have slant tubes.
Yeah. And our yeast mode, basically what we did is we took about 30 different strains of expired yeast, put them in a carboy, made a big starter, spun it up for a day or two, and then put those into little slants and pass that out. That was a fun competition we did a couple years ago. We haven't done that in a while, so maybe this is another. You were the first to know. Maybe we'll do it again.
To me, I don't know if it's worth it. It can be fun for a homebrew club project, I think, and I think Babel did it, where they had their own little yeast bank full of slants that Bill had actually frozen using glycerin. I think it's about 20% use glycerin, 20% that glycerin basically helps the yeast. It allows the yeast to not rupture,
explode when it freezes.
So, I mean, you need glycerin, you need sterile water or sterile wort, and a bunch of slant tubes. And ideally, I think you keep it at like 40 below or something like that.
You keep it cold.
Ridiculous.
But obviously, we know that it's not going to be possible for most people.
So I don't know if it'd be fun experiment for a homebrew club, but for a single homebrewer, I don't know if it's worth it.
Go ahead.
I mean, to me, I just had a bunch of mason jars from overbuilt yeast starters. I'd have a Saison yeast, English yeast, an American yeast, and maybe a Belgian yeast.
Yeah. And
maybe a lager yeast sitting in my fridge, and I just throw it into a weak starter and step it up from there. Yeah. It was kind of my preferred way.
Depending on what style you're looking to do, I mean, it could be one of those things where if you brewing with the same yeast often, regularly, like once every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, maybe it might be worth to make a bunch of slants, make one big starter, step it up, make a bunch of slants, and then just kind of add that if you're not going to repitch on or top crop or things like that based on which style. That way you can kind of keep a clean strain. Or if you really get out there, since I know some people that have harvested their own yeast, November's the month to do that.
Wild.
Yeah, wild yeast, where you just take a flat pan of wort in November's, because after that first freeze, it kills most of the nasties, and you can put that out for a day, and you'll start to see this slop and foam growing on top of this pan of wort. You can harvest that off. We've even had somebody make harvest yeast off of cattails.
Yeah.
You remember that? And that was really good. That was a really good beer.
That was awesome. He brought in the beer he made with cattails, and then the same beer he fermented with USO5.
Yeah.
And they were almost the same thing. He somehow just got like the cleanest yeast off of these wild cattails.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. Yeast is everywhere. It's everywhere. So it's kind of fun, and it's basically just isolating. And the different strains are just isolating the strains that give you the flavors and the flavors that you want. And that's really what it is with all these different strains, is those particular strains, those particular little beasties are known to give you a certain perspective. I guess I'm not having trouble thinking of a word to say that's the proper word that has a lot of syllables in it, but that's really what it is. And it's fun to harvest your own yeast and things like that. But I guess back to my thought with the slant tube, I think if you want to try it, it's kind of like a sourdough starter. Once you go down that road, you have a new pet. You kind of keep it alive.
Before the next question, if you're going to do slants, I recommend stepping them up. And by that, I mean doing very small, because a slant's like 10 milliliters or something like that, tiny, maybe a little more. But stepping up that tiny bit of yeast, you're going to want to put it into like 500 milliliters of 1020 wort, which is like 2 ounces, maybe 1 ounce of DME and a half liter of water. And then see what kind of activity you get, smell it, make sure it's clean smelling or smells Belgian or smells British, whatever it is you're propping up. And then take that once it looks like it's active and throw another liter of fresh wort onto it. And you should have a nice pitch for, say, like a 6 to 7% ABV beer. If you're going to go higher than that, probably step it up again.
Yeah.
So it's just always small steps. I've always had the best luck doing small steps when trying to either revive some yeast from last summer or something like that, or some old stuff in my fridge. It's just step it up slowly and take your time, and it should be healthy.
Yeah, yeast is, I guess we did forget to say what yeast is. It's a single-celled eukaryotic organism. It is a fungi. It's everywhere. Fungi. Yeah. But anyway, we have another question.
From Bill.
Is it worth to add hops to a starter?
I never have.
Yeah, that's a good question, because hops are a preservative. It's going to keep some of the other...
It may be a good idea if you're going to leave it on the stir plate a little longer, or, I think I did it one time because I remember reading on Homebrew Talk a few years ago that some guy was doing it mostly so that he could actually drink his starter wort. Because I think he was doing his starters, and he was so bummed about dumping a liter of starter wort and getting rid of a liter of
homebrewers were frugal
potential beer. Like, even though it's 3% maybe after a day on the stir plate. Yeah. But
that's a good question. I'm trying to think of the drawbacks to it. You're locked into, well, not really locked in, but you're going to have a certain flavor profile. I don't know if it's going to carry over, but
yeah, if you're going to do it, maybe like 1 or 2 pellets.
Yeah. Such a small amount just as a preservative.
And not like Citra or anything like that. Nothing expensive.
Yeah. Check out our scrap hop bin and find something probably a low alpha and just use a little bit of it. That's a good. I've never done it.
It doesn't hurt if you're going to actually like my recommended way of reusing yeast. If you're going to use it, that same pack of yeast, and overbuild it and save some for another starter, I wouldn't recommend hopping it. You just want pure yeast to save. But if it's all going into the same batch, sure. I don't see what the huge benefit of it would be.
But if anyone wants to try it, and let us know. Okay. But yeah.
It might make your starter wort taste a little better.
Yeah, you can drink your starter wort.
It's definitely a preservative, but if it's going in 24 hours,
I suppose you could use cheesy cheesy old hops.
Sure.
Ew.
You do whatever the heck you
It
want.
smell awesome.
It's homebrew.
Yeah. That's the fun thing. Yeah, you're right. It's homebrew. You can kind of do whatever. There are no rules. Kind of. There's some rules. Yeah, there's some rules. But
I think we covered everything.
I think we've covered, everything that was predetermined. Had some fantastic questions again. Thank you. But I think we're going to wrap this one up, and we look forward to seeing everyone next month. And again, if anyone has a topic that they are just dying to know more about, or just to hear us talk about, either hit us up an email, type a message here in the chat below. This will be on the YouTube channel and Facebook. So if you missed any part of it and want to learn a little bit more, listen to our sweet voices once again, you can absolutely find this again. But we are going to finish for tonight, and thank you for everyone that came out and spent the time to listen to us talk about something we're very passionate about, something we love, and that is homebrew and yeast and everything it has to offer. But for now, we're going to sign off. I'm Andy.
I'm Ryan. Bye, Grandma. Love ya.
We'll talk to you guys later. Thank you so much.